The moment I entered the cathedral, something shifted in the atmosphere. Whispers ceased abruptly, champagne glasses froze mid-toast, and a sea of unfamiliar faces turned toward me in unison. Some expressions registered shock, others contempt, and a brave few managed polite smiles that never reached their eyes. I wasn't supposed to be here. That much was clear from the way Richard's new wife, Vanessa, clutched her pearls as if I might lunge for them. 20 years had passed since most of these people had seen me, and now here I was, attending my ex-husband's memorial service like an uninvited ghost returning to haunt them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Richard Westbrook, brilliant surgeon, philanthropist, and the man who once promised to love me forever, lay in an ornate mahogany casket surrounded by arrangements of white roses and lilies that must have cost a small fortune. His second wife sat in the front row, dabbing at dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, occasionally turning to whisper something to my daughters, Sophia and Olivia. Both of them stared straight ahead, deliberately avoiding my gaze as if looking at me might somehow dishonor their father's memory. I understood their hesitation. To them, I was the woman who abandoned the family, who walked away from luxury and stability for reasons they were too young to comprehend and too hurt to later investigate. The narrative Richard crafted after I left had been meticulous. I was unstable, selfish, possibly involved with another man. None of it was true, but truth rarely survives when wealth and influence align against it. I moved silently along the side aisle, feeling the weight of judgment with each step. The cathedral's stained glass cast kaleidoscope shadows across the marble floor, blues, reds, and ambers dancing beneath my feet as I found a seat in the back row. I could hear fragments of hurried conversations. Is that really her? After all this time? The nerve. I didn't flinch. I kept my spine straight, my chin lifted. The dignity I'd fought so hard to reclaim fully intact despite their scrutiny. This wasn't about them. This wasn't even about Richard anymore. I came because there were words left unspoken, truths buried beneath decades of carefully constructed lies. I came because something inside me, perhaps the strongest part, needed to witness this final chapter, to stand in my truth even when no one else could see it. The service proceeded with all the pomp one would expect for a man of Richard's status. The mayor spoke about his contributions to the city. Colleagues praised his surgical innovations. Friends reminisced about his generosity and wit. Not one person mentioned his capacity for cruelty, the careful way he could dismantle a person's sense of self while maintaining a perfect public image. The eulogies painted a portrait of a saint, not the man I had known in the privacy of our home. I sat quietly, neither crying nor protesting, simply observing the elaborate performance of grief around me. My daughters had grown into beautiful women. Sophia, with her straight posture and perfect makeup, was every inch her father's daughter, composed, controlled, and distant. Olivia, the younger one, seemed less certain, occasionally glancing around the room as if searching for something she couldn't name. As the service neared its conclusion, a tall man in an impeccable charcoal suit approached the podium. He carried a sleek leather portfolio and projected an air of authority that immediately quieted the room. "I'm Jonathan Mercer, Dr. Westbrook's attorney," he announced, voice clear and unwavering. Richard left explicit instructions that certain provisions of his will be read today, immediately following the service. A murmur rippled through the congregation. This was unexpected. Wills were typically read privately, not announced to an entire funeral gathering. Vanessa straightened in her seat, smoothing her black dress with manicured hands. Jonathan opened his portfolio and cleared his throat. These instructions were updated just 3 months ago, with sound mind and full legal oversight. He paused, scanning the document before continuing. To Eleanor Westbrook. The silence that followed. My name was absolute. Every head turned, searching the crowd until dozens of eyes found me in my corner seat. I felt the blood drain from my face. Eleanor Westbrook. Not Eleanor Camden, the name I'd returned to after the divorce. In his final directive, Richard had called me by his name. A name I'd fought to escape. Before we continue, Jonathan said, I've been instructed to ask everyone to remain seated. What follows may be unexpected. I watched Richard's brother Michael shift uncomfortably in his seat. Vanessa's spine went rigid, and there, just visible from my angle, was the slight upward turn of Richard's brother's lips. Not quite a smile, but a smirk of satisfaction. He thought he knew what was coming. They all did. The final public humiliation of the woman who had dared to leave the great Richard Westbrook. They couldn't have been more wrong. Before we continue this story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. I first met Richard Westbrook in my final year of medical school. I was 26, ambitious, and determined to become a pediatric surgeon, despite the field being dominated by men who looked at me with thinly veiled skepticism. Richard was already an attending physician, brilliant and charismatic at 32, with a reputation for surgical excellence that drew patients from across the country. We met during a complicated procedure, a congenital heart defect in a newborn that required both our specialties. For 8 tense hours, we worked side by side, communicating, in the shorthand of medical professionals focused entirely on saving a life. When the surgery succeeded, he looked at me across the operating table with newfound respect. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You're good, he said simply, eyes crinkling above his surgical mask. Most residents would have cracked under that pressure. I'm not most residents, I replied, matching his gaze without flinching. Something sparked between us that day. Professional admiration that quickly evolved into coffee meetings to discuss cases, then dinners where medicine gave way to personal revelations, and finally, a romance that swept through my carefully ordered life like a hurricane. Richard was intense, passionate about medicine, but equally passionate about art, music, and literature. He quoted Shakespeare while preparing morning coffee and took me to the symphony on rare nights off. He made me feel seen in a way I never had before, not just as a promising doctor, but as a woman with dreams beyond the hospital walls. Our courtship was swift and dazzling. 6 months after our first date, he proposed during a weekend trip to his family's lake house, presenting a diamond ring that caught the sunset in its facets. I said yes without hesitation, believing I had found my equal, my partner in both profession and life. The wedding was lavish. Richard's family had old money and older expectations. Over 300 guests gathered at the Westbrook estate, a sprawling property with manicured gardens that had hosted generations of society weddings. I had no family to speak of, having lost my parents in a car accident during my undergraduate years, so I stood alone at the altar joining not just a man but an entire dynasty. You're one of us now, Richard's mother whispered as she kissed my cheek at the reception, though her eyes remained cool and assessing. The early years were good, or at least I convinced myself they were. We purchased a Victorian brownstone in the historic district and renovated it room by room, blending his affinity for antiques with my preference for clean, modern lines. I completed my residency while Richard's reputation continued to grow. When I became pregnant with Sophia just 2 years into our marriage, we converted the third-floor study into a nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow and filling bookshelves with classics Richard insisted would shape our child's mind even before she could read. Our daughter will have everything, he promised, hand resting on my growing belly. The best education, every opportunity. She'll never know limitation. I believed him. I believed in us. The brilliant medical couple building a legacy of healing, and family. When Sophia arrived, perfect and pink and screaming with healthy lungs, Richard wept as he held her. 2 years later, Olivia joined our family, completing what appeared from the outside to be a perfect picture. But perfection, I would learn, was Richard's obsession and ultimately our undoing. The facade began to crack in subtle ways, so gradual, I barely noticed the shift. It started with small comments about my career choices after the girls were born. "Pediatric surgery requires such demanding hours," he remarked one evening as I reviewed cases after putting the girls to bed. "Wouldn't a private practice with regular hours make more sense now that you're a mother?" His concern seemed reasonable, even loving. But when I suggested he might also consider scaling back his surgical schedule, his response was immediate and firm. "That's different, Eleanor. My career is at a critical juncture. The research I'm doing could change thousands of lives." I understood the importance of his work, so I adjusted. I took a position at a prestigious children's hospital with somewhat more predictable hours, though it meant stepping back from the cutting-edge surgeries that had once defined my professional ambitions. I told myself it was temporary, a necessary compromise for our family. Richard called it the sensible choice and praised my dedication to motherhood, though something in his tone suggested he had expected nothing less. As the girls grew, so did Richard's expectations, not just for them, but for me, for our home, for every aspect of our shared life. Dinner parties became elaborate productions where I was expected to showcase both culinary expertise and perfect social grace, while discussing current medical research and ensuring our daughters performed like well-trained prodigies when presented to guests. "Eleanor's taking some time to focus on family," Richard would explain to colleagues who inquired about my reduced surgical schedule, his arm around my waist in what appeared to be a supportive gesture but felt increasingly like ownership. "She's excelling at motherhood the same way she excelled in medicine." The praise sounded hollow, as if my worth was measured solely by how well I supported his narrative of family perfection. I found myself speaking less at these gatherings, smiling, more, becoming the elegant accessory to Richard's growing legend. When Sophia was 8 and Olivia 6, I received an offer to join an innovative pediatric surgical team developing new approaches to treating congenital defects, exactly the work I had dreamed of doing. The position would require more hours, occasional travel to medical conferences, and total commitment to advancing the field. I was elated, reinvigorated by the possibility of reclaiming part of myself that had been dormant. That night, I shared the news with Richard over a celebratory dinner I had prepared myself, complete with his favorite bourbon-glazed salmon and asparagus. "They specifically requested me," I explained, unable to contain my excitement. "Dr. Harrington said my research from residency is still being referenced. This could be groundbreaking, Richard." He studied me across the candlelit table, twirling his wine glass between long surgeon's fingers. "And the girls? Who will be there when they return from school, help with homework, prepare for their piano recitals and swim meets?" "We'll adjust," I said confidently. "We can hire additional help. Maybe Mrs. Peterson could extend her hours. The girls adore her." "A housekeeper is not a mother, Eleanor." His voice remained calm, reasonable. "The girls are at critical developmental stages. Sophia's showing remarkable aptitude for mathematics, and Olivia needs consistent support with her reading. This isn't the time to prioritize your career ambitions over their needs." "It's not an either-or situation," I countered, feeling a familiar pressure building behind my ribs. "I can be both a dedicated mother and a surgeon. You manage it as a father." Something cold flickered across his features. "That's different," he said, the same words he'd used years before. "My career was established before we had children. The trajectory was set. The girls understand my work saves lives." "So does mine," I said quietly. Richard reached across the table to take my hand, his expression softening into something that resembled compassion, but felt more like pity. Of course it does, darling. Your work has always been exceptional. But is that operating room more important than watching Sophia win her science fair or helping Olivia overcome her shyness? Those moments don't come back. The guilt was instant and overwhelming, exactly as he intended. I spent that night staring at the ceiling, torn between my resurgent professional passion and the narrative of motherhood Richard had crafted. For me. By morning, I had convinced myself he was right. I declined the position with promises to consider similar opportunities when the time is right. Richard called me selfless and extraordinary, praising my decision to colleagues and friends as evidence of my superior maternal instincts. To celebrate my choice, he purchased an extravagant diamond bracelet that felt more like a shackle than a gift. I wore it to hospital fundraisers and charity galas, standing beside him in designer dresses as he was repeatedly honored for surgical innovations and philanthropic contributions. What no one saw were the quiet moments at home, where Richard's perfectionism turned our family life into a carefully orchestrated performance. The girls' schedules were planned to the minute, their academic achievements tracked and compared against Richard's exacting standards. Our home was immaculate, meals were nutritionally optimal and aesthetically pleasing, and I maintained a calendar of social engagements that positioned us at the center of the city's medical and philanthropic elite. Perception matters, Richard reminded me often. How we present ourselves to the world shapes opportunities for all of us. I became the curator of our family image, elegant, accomplished, and unfailingly supportive of my brilliant husband. If I occasionally felt hollow inside, if my hands sometimes itched for surgical instruments instead of garden shears or silk scarves, I buried those feelings beneath layers of grateful wife and devoted mother. I told myself this was the life I had chosen, the compromise that made our family function. The turning point came not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a quiet moment that exposed the chasm between appearance and reality. It was our 20th anniversary, and Richard had organized a lavish celebration at the city's most exclusive restaurant. Colleagues, friends, and family gathered to toast our perfect partnership. Richard gave a speech about our journey together, crediting me with creating the stable foundation that allowed his career to flourish. Eleanor has always understood what truly matters, he told the rapt audience. While some might have chosen professional accolades, she chose us, her family. There's no greater wisdom than knowing where your real value lies. The room applauded. Women gave me admiring glances for my apparent contentment with supporting greatness rather than chasing it. Men nodded approvingly at my feminine sacrifice. And something inside me, something that had been dormant for years, finally woke up and screamed. I maintained my composure through dessert and champagne toasts, smiling and accepting congratulations on 2 decades of marriage. But later that night, as Richard slept peacefully beside me, I slipped from our bed and wandered through our perfect home, touching the evidence of a life carefully constructed to reflect Richard's vision rather than my own desires. In Sophia's room, I found her medical school applications. She had inherited her father's surgical ambition and his unwavering focus. In Olivia's room, half-finished poems and sketches revealed an artistic temperament she rarely showed in Richard's presence. Both girls had absorbed the unspoken lesson that certain parts of themselves were acceptable for public display, while others must remain hidden. I ended up in my home office, a space that had gradually transformed from a place of medical research to a command center for household management and charity committee work. In the bottom drawer of my desk, locked and nearly forgotten, I kept a folder containing job offers and research opportunities I had declined over the years. 20 years of professional roads not taken, 20 years of not the right time. That night, sitting alone in the dark, I finally acknowledged the truth. I had not chosen this life. I had surrendered to it inch by inch, compromise by compromise, until Eleanor the surgeon, Eleanor the independent thinker, Eleanor the woman with dreams of her own had disappeared entirely. In her place stood Mrs. Richard Westbrook, perfect. Wife, mother, and society hostess, a role I played so convincingly that even I had almost believed it was who I truly was. The realization didn't bring immediate action. Change, especially after decades of careful conformity, requires courage that must be cultivated slowly. For months, I observed my life as if from a distance, noting the subtle ways Richard maintained control. Financial decisions made unilaterally, social connections that revolved exclusively around his career and interests, even the decoration of our home reflecting his preferences rather than mine. I began making small adjustments, testing boundaries. I volunteered at a medical clinic serving underprivileged communities, using surgical skills that had grown rusty from disuse. I opened a separate bank account with money saved from the household budget Richard allotted monthly. I reconnected with former colleagues, tentatively exploring whether my medical career might still be salvageable after years of minimal practice. Richard noticed the shifts in my behavior, but initially seemed more amused than concerned. "Having a bit of a midlife crisis, darling?" he asked one evening, finding me reviewing medical journals instead of planning the hospital board's annual gala. "Perhaps we should plan a vacation. The Caribbean might lift your spirits." "I'm not having a crisis," I replied calmly. "I'm remembering who I am." His smile remained fixed, but something in his eyes hardened. "And who exactly would that be? The woman who hasn't performed significant surgery in 15 years? The doctor whose research is now considered outdated? Be realistic, Eleanor. Your value now lies in the life we've built together, not in chasing professional glory that's long past." His words were designed to wound, to remind me of my supposed irrelevance in the world beyond our home. In earlier years, such calculated cruelty would have sent me retreating into the safety of his approved narrative. But something had changed. I had changed, and instead of shrinking, I felt a surge of clarity. "My value," I said quietly, "has never been yours to determine." The argument that followed was cold and precise, like a surgical dissection of our marriage. Richard didn't raise his voice, he never did, but his words cut with practiced precision. "You've become selfish," he informed me, clinical in his assessment. "After everything I've given you, everything I've built for this family, you're indulging in childish fantasies of independence. It's beneath you, Eleanor, beneath the woman I married." "The woman you married was a surgeon," I reminded him. "She had ambitions beyond being your accessory." "And she adjusted those ambitions for the greater good of our family," he countered. "That's what mature adults do, Eleanor. They recognize priorities beyond their own ego." We circled each other with these arguments for weeks, Richard alternating between dismissive condescension and strategic reminders of my dependence on him, financial, social, even emotional. He weaponized the girls, suggesting that my desire for greater autonomy reflected inadequate maternal devotion. He reminded me of my surgical skills atrophy, the competitive nature of medicine, the unlikelihood of rebuilding a career at my age. "No one will take you seriously," he said during one particularly brutal exchange. "You'll humiliate yourself and, by extension, this family. Is that really what you want?" What I wanted was to breathe without permission, to practice medicine without apology, to exist in the world as Eleanor First, not as an extension of Richard Westbrook's carefully curated image. The final breaking point arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Richard had left for a medical conference in Boston, and I was reviewing household accounts in preparation for an upcoming renovation he had planned for our kitchen, a project I had not requested but was expected to oversee. Among the financial documents, I discovered papers for a real estate purchase Richard had made 6 months earlier. A luxury condominium in the name of his research assistant, Vanessa Pierce. Further investigation revealed a pattern of bonuses and research stipends flowing to Vanessa over the past 2 years, along with expensive gifts and weekend conferences that appeared on credit card statements but not in any official medical calendars. The evidence was irrefutable, and in retrospect, unsurprising, Richard, who demanded perfection in all things, had created a parallel life where he could escape the very standards he imposed on everyone else. I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I used his absence to take stock of my situation with brutal honesty. I was 52 years old. My surgical career had been effectively sacrificed at the altar of Richard's ambition. Our daughters were in college, Sophia at Harvard Medical School following directly in her father's footsteps, Olivia at Berklee College of Music, a choice Richard had initially opposed but eventually accepted as an acceptable creative outlet. Our social circle consisted entirely of Richard's colleagues and supporters. Even our home, beautiful as it was, represented his vision rather than our shared dreams. If I left, what would remain of me? The question terrified me, but for the first time in decades, it also exhilarated me. Perhaps finding the answer was exactly what I needed. When Richard returned from Boston, I was waiting in his study with divorce papers already prepared. "What is this?" he asked, though his expression suggested he knew exactly what lay on his antique mahogany desk. "Freedom," I replied simply. "Yours and mine." I didn't mention Vanessa. Infidelity seemed almost irrelevant compared to the deeper betrayal of systematically dismantling my identity over 20 years of marriage. This wasn't about his affair. It was about reclaiming my life. Richard's response was coldly pragmatic. He didn't deny the affair, didn't apologize, didn't attempt reconciliation. Instead, he outlined the consequences of my decision with surgical precision. "You'll leave with nothing," he stated flatly. "The prenuptial agreement is airtight. The house is in my name, as are the investments, the vacation properties, even your car. Your name isn't on a single significant asset." "I'm aware," I said, having already confirmed these facts with a preliminary legal consultation. "The girls will see this as abandonment," he continued. "They're old enough to understand what really matters, and they won't forgive you for destroying their family over a midlife identity crisis." That cut deeper, but I held my ground. I believe they're also old enough to eventually understand that a woman has value beyond her role as wife and mother. Richard laughed, the sound entirely without humor. "How inspirational. And what exactly will you do, Eleanor? Where will you go? Who will you be when you're no longer Mrs. Richard Westbrook?" I had asked myself the same questions for months, and while I didn't have complete answers, I had something more important, the determination to find out. "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but I'd rather face that uncertainty than spend another day living someone else's definition of my life." The divorce was swift but brutal. Richard leveraged every advantage, financial, legal, and social. The prenuptial agreement I had signed at 26, naive and deeply in love, left me with a settlement that barely covered 2 years of modest living expenses. Our social circle, faced with choosing sides, predictably aligned with the powerful surgeon rather than his unstable wife. Most painfully, Richard systematically turned our daughters against me, presenting my departure as selfish abandonment rather than necessary self-preservation. "Mom's going through something," I overheard him telling Sophia during one of her visits home. "Some women struggle with purposelessness once their primary role as mothers is complete. We need to be patient with her, even if her choices are disappointing." I moved into a small apartment across town and began rebuilding from foundation level. At 52, returning to surgery was impractical after such a lengthy absence, but my medical knowledge remained valuable. I found a position teaching anatomy at the State University's medical school. Not prestigious, certainly not lucrative, but intellectually engaging and genuinely satisfying. I volunteered at a women's health clinic serving underinsured patients. I took art classes, joined a hiking group, and gradually constructed a life defined by my own choices rather than someone else's expectations. The hardest part was the distance from my daughters. Sophia, deeply enmeshed in her father's worldview, barely communicated except through formal, infrequent emails. Olivia maintained more regular contact, but seemed perpetually torn between loyalty to her father and genuine concern for me. Holiday gatherings became diplomatic negotiations, with the girls often choosing to celebrate with Richard, and eventually Vanessa, who transitioned smoothly from research assistant to second wife within a year of our divorce. 5 years passed in this new reality. I didn't become wealthy or famous. I didn't revolutionize medicine or find some spectacular second-act career. Instead, I achieved something far more precious. I reclaimed my voice, my choices, and my authentic self. The woman who emerged from Richard Westbrook's shadow wasn't perfect or extraordinary by society's metrics, but she was real and wholly her own. When news of Richard's sudden death reached me, a massive heart attack while performing surgery, swift and unexpected at 62, I felt a complex wave of emotions that couldn't be neatly categorized as either grief or relief. We had been divorced for 5 years but connected for nearly 30. His absence from the world represented the definitive end of a significant chapter in my life. I didn't expect to be included in the funeral arrangements. Richard and Vanessa had been married for 4 years by then, and my daughters, now grown women of 30 and 28, naturally deferred to their stepmother's planning. I learned about the memorial service through Olivia, who called with the details and a tentative, "I'm not sure if you'll want to come, but I thought you should know." "Would you like me to be there?" I asked directly. Her hesitation spoke. I think it might be complicated, Mom. Vanessa has planned everything very specifically. Dad's colleagues will all be there. It's going to be a big society event." "I understand," I said, genuinely meaning it. "I won't attend if it would make things more difficult for you and Sophia." "I'll call you after," she promised. "Maybe we can have dinner next week. Just us." I accepted this arrangement with the grace I had cultivated through years of navigating the fractured terrain of our family, but after a sleepless night considering what Richard's death meant, not just for him but for all of us who had orbited his powerful presence, I reached a different conclusion. I didn't need to attend for Richard. I didn't even need to attend for my daughters, who had grown accustomed to compartmentalizing their relationships with their parents. I needed to attend for myself, to mark the end of an era from a position of strength rather than exclusion. To stand in my truth, one final time in the presence of those who had witnessed my erasure but not my resurrection. The decision made, I selected a simple but elegant black dress, arranged my silver hair, which I had stopped coloring after the divorce, in a classic chignon, and drove to the cathedral where Richard would be memorialized by the society that had embraced him and rejected me. Which brings us back to that moment, standing in the cathedral while whispers rippled through the congregation, finding my seat alone, while judgment and curiosity followed my every move, listening to eulogies that canonized a complicated man, who had been both brilliant and cruel, watching my daughters from a distance and hoping they might someday understand. And then, the unexpected announcement from Jonathan Mercer, Richard's attorney, that portions of the will would be read immediately following the service. The statement of my name, Eleanor Westbrook, that turned every head in my direction. The visible smirk on Michael's face, anticipating my public humiliation. The tension that hung in the air like the moment before lightning strikes. No one, least of all me, could have predicted what would happen next. The cafe Olivia chose was a small, elegant establishment several blocks from the cathedral, far enough to escape the lingering funeral attendees, but close enough to walk in our formal attire. Inside, weathered oak tables and vintage photographs created an atmosphere of timeless comfort. The barista recognized Olivia, greeting her by name before preparing what was apparently her usual order. It struck me how little I knew of my daughter's daily life. Her favorite coffee shop, her regular order, the small rituals that structured her days. 5 years of separation had created a chasm of unknown details. We settled at a corner table beneath a window that bathed us in gentle afternoon light. For several moments, we sat in silence, our hands wrapped around warm ceramic mugs, the space between us filled with unspoken questions. Olivia looked both younger and older than her 28 years. Her eyes reflected the emotional exhaustion of grief, yet there was something newly resolute in the set of her jaw. "I don't know where to start," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Neither do I confessed. "This isn't a conversation I ever expected to have." Olivia traced the rim of her mug with one fingertip, gathering her thoughts. "Did you know? About your contributions to Dad's research being taken? Was that part of why you left?" The question cut to the heart of decades of complex history, yet deserved an honest answer. "I knew some of it," I said carefully. "The early papers we genuinely co-authored. I saw when my name began disappearing from publications, when ideas we'd developed together suddenly became Richard's breakthrough approach. But it happened so gradually, interwoven with everything else. The subtle pressure to step back professionally, the constant emphasis on my role as mother and wife above all else." I paused, considering how to explain the insidious nature of such erasure to someone who hadn't experienced it. "It wasn't a single moment of theft, Olivia. It was the slow accumulation of small surrenders that I was convinced were necessary. Compromises for our family. By the time I recognized the pattern, it felt both undeniable and impossible to challenge." Olivia nodded slowly, her expression troubled. "I never questioned it," she said, regret evident in her voice. "Dad was the brilliant surgeon and you were Mom. That's just how it was in my mind. Even after you left, when Dad talked about his work, I never once wondered where your contributions might have been." "You weren't supposed to question it," I replied gently. "The narrative was carefully constructed over decades, reinforced by every award ceremony, every journal publication, every dinner party conversation. Your father was extraordinarily skilled at shaping perception, not just the world's, but our families as well." "Sophia's struggling with this," Olivia said after a moment. "She built her entire identity around following Dad's path. Finding out that path was compromised. It's shaking everything she thought she knew." I felt a surge of compassion for my older daughter, whose rigid adherence to her father's values had always seemed like rejection of me, but now looked more like the desperate fulfillment of impossible expectations. "I imagine it would," I said, softly. "It's difficult to discover the hero you've emulated had feet of clay." "She'll come around," Olivia said, though uncertainty tinged her voice. "She just needs time to process." I reached across the table to cover her hand with mine. "There's no timeline for any of this, sweetheart. Not for Sophia, not for you, not even for me. We're all navigating uncharted territory." Olivia's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I should have reached out more after you left. I knew something wasn't right with Dad's version of events, but it was easier to just go along. Especially when Sophia was so adamant about loyalty to him." She brushed away a tear with her free hand. "I'm sorry, Mom." "You were 23, I reminded her. Caught between parents in an impossible situation. I never blamed you for protecting yourself." "But that's just it," she said, frustrated. "You protected yourself by leaving an impossible situation, and we condemned you for it. Meanwhile, Dad was, what? Systematically erasing you professionally while presenting himself as the victim personally?" She shook her head in disbelief. "How did we not see it?" The question wasn't really directed at me, but I answered anyway. "Because your father was exceptionally skilled at controlling the narrative. He'd had decades of practice presenting a carefully curated image to the world. When I left, he simply applied those same skills to reshaping your understanding of our marriage." Olivia's phone buzzed insistently on the table. She glanced at the screen and grimaced. "It's Vanessa's lawyer." They've been calling non-stop since we left the cathedral. She declined the call with a definitive tap. They can wait. I raised an eyebrow. They'll be looking to contest the will. Let them try, Olivia said with unexpected fierceness. Jonathan seemed pretty confident about Dad's documentation. She wasn't wrong. Richard had always been meticulous about legal matters. If he'd decided to redirect his assets to me, he would have ensured the arrangement was unassailable. Still, I harbored no illusions about the battles ahead. Vanessa would fight, as would Michael and possibly other Westbrook relatives. The professional community might resist acknowledging the historical revision of Richard's contributions. My daughters would continue processing revelations that challenged their understanding of both their father and their childhood. And I would need to determine what to do with resources and recognition that had come decades too late to restore the career that might have been. Olivia's phone buzzed again, this time with a text message that made her expression soften. "It's Sophia," she said, sounding surprised. "She wants to know where we are." She looked up at me uncertainly. "Would it be okay if she joined us? I think she wants to talk." The prospect of facing Sophia, my brilliant, difficult firstborn who had embraced her father's values so completely, was both terrifying and necessary. "Of course," I said, striving for a steadiness I didn't entirely feel. "Tell her we'll be here." As Olivia typed a response, I excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment alone to gather my thoughts before what would undoubtedly be an emotionally charged conversation. In the small, elegant washroom, I stood before the mirror, studying the woman reflected there. Silver hair framing a face marked by both strength and sorrow. Eyes clear and direct in a way they hadn't been during my married years. Posture straight rather than accommodating. At 57, I looked more authentically myself than I had at 37, when I'd been deeply embedded in Richard's carefully constructed world. I removed the sealed envelope from my purse, Richard's private message, the words he'd apparently labored over during his final weeks. My fingers trembled slightly as I broke the seal, unfolding the single sheet of heavy stationery covered in Richard's distinctive handwriting, noticeably shakier than I remembered. "Eleanor, by the time you read this, the public acknowledgement of my failures will have been made. That statement was necessary for your vindication, but this letter is different. These words are not for historical correction or legal record. They are simply from a man who wronged you deeply, recognizing too late the damage he inflicted. I have spent my final months reflecting on the man I became and the choices that defined me. The pancreatic cancer diagnosis, terminal from the outset, forced a reckoning I should have faced decades ago. Facing mortality has a remarkable way of stripping away pretense and revealing truth. The truth is that I was terrified of your brilliance from the beginning. That day in the operating room when we first worked together, I recognized something in you that I had spent years convincing myself was unique to me. Not just surgical skill, but innate understanding, intuitive brilliance that can't be taught. It both attracted and threatened me. I told myself my actions were protective, that the strategies I employed were for your benefit or our family's stability. I disguised control as concern, professional theft as practical division of labor. But the reality, which I can finally acknowledge as my life concludes, is far simpler and far worse. I systematically diminished you because your potential threatened the narrative I had constructed about myself. Every time I removed your name from research we conducted together, every time I presented your insights as my own, every time I discouraged your professional advancement while framing it as support for your maternal role, these weren't thoughtless oversights or practical compromises. They were deliberate, acts of self-protection by a man who feared being overshadowed by his wife's talent. When you finally left, my narrative of abandonment wasn't just for public consumption. It was the lie I needed to tell myself to avoid confronting my own culpability. It was easier to cast you as selfish than to acknowledge how systematically I had suffocated your gifts to elevate my own. I have made what legal amends are possible through my will, The foundation, the company, the patents. These rightfully belong in your hands, not as charity, but as belated justice. What I cannot restore are the years taken, the career derailed, the recognition denied. For that theft of possibility, there can be no adequate compensation. I do not ask forgiveness. That would be another act of selfishness. Instead, I offer this acknowledgement. You were always the more talented surgeon, the more innovative researcher, and ultimately the more courageous human being. When faced with the choice between authentic selfhood and comfortable submission, you chose the harder, truer path. While I constructed an image of perfection, you did the harder work of living with integrity. In my final days, that is the quality I have most deeply admired and most profoundly missed. Your unflinching commitment to truth, even when that truth was costly. It is a quality I recognize too late to emulate in my own life, but perhaps not. Too late to acknowledge in yours. Richard. I refolded the letter carefully, returning it to my purse with hands that had steadied. Richard's private confession offered no new information beyond what he'd publicly declared, but its intimate acknowledgement of the specific nature of his actions, not thoughtless but calculated, not accidental but deliberate, provided a validation I hadn't known I still needed. He had seen me clearly all along, had recognized my capabilities and potential, and had chosen to systematically diminish them not out of ignorance but out of fear. There was something oddly freeing in that recognition. The erasure hadn't been due to my inadequacy, but to capabilities that had threatened his carefully constructed self-image. I splashed cool water on my face, reapplied lipstick, and straightened my shoulders. Outside, Sophia would be arriving. My daughter, who had modeled herself so completely on her father's example, who had embraced his values and ambitions as her own. The conversation ahead would be difficult, but Richard's letter had reminded me of something essential. I had always possessed the courage to face difficult truths. It was, perhaps, the quality that had ultimately saved me when remaining in our marriage would have meant the complete surrender of self. When I returned to the table, Sophia was already there, sitting stiffly beside her sister. At 30, she was a striking woman, tall and elegant like Richard, with his intensity and focus evident in every line of her posture. Her medical career was already distinguished, her surgical fellowship at Massachusetts General Positioning, her to follow directly in her father's professional footsteps. Or so we had all believed until today's revelations. She looked up as I approached, her expression inscrutable. "Mother," she said formally, using the term she had adopted after the divorce in place of the warmer mom of earlier years. "Sophia," I replied, retaking my seat. "I'm glad you came." "I almost didn't," she admitted, her direct gaze so reminiscent of Richard that it created an almost physical ache in my chest. "But after what was revealed today, I have questions that need answers." "I'll tell you whatever I can," I promised. Sophia folded her hands precisely on the table, her surgical training evident in the economy of her movements. "Those research papers Father mentioned, the ones where your contributions were overlooked. I need to know specifically which methodologies, which innovations actually originated with you." The question was quintessentially Sophia, practical, direct, focused on concrete details rather than emotional implications. I recognized the approach. It was how she had always processed difficult information, by breaking it down into manageable, factual components. "It would take hours to detail everything," I said gently, "and I'm not sure this is the right moment." "I need to know," she interrupted, her voice tightly controlled. "I've built my entire career following his techniques. I've published papers extending his methodologies. I've presented at conferences about innovations attributed solely to him." Her composure cracked slightly. "If those foundations are compromised, I need to understand exactly what I've been building upon." I understood then that this wasn't just about historical accuracy for Sophia. It was about her own professional identity and integrity. She needed to know not just what her father had done, but how those actions might have inadvertently made her complicit in the continued erasure of my contributions. The pediatric valve replacement technique that bears your father's name, I began carefully, was initially conceptualized during my final fellowship year. The approach to maintaining circulation while minimizing bypass time, that was based on observations I made during a particularly challenging case involving an infant with hypoplastic left heart syndrome. Your father refined the instrumentation. Certainly, but the core methodology was documented in research we conducted jointly. Sophia grew paler with each word, but her gaze remained steady. The Westbrook method for tetralogy of Fallot repair? She asked, naming the procedure that had established Richard's international reputation. A collaborative development, I confirmed. Your father's surgical skill was genuinely exceptional, Sophia. His hands could execute what many surgeons couldn't attempt. But the conceptual framework, the specific sequence of repair, the approach to maintaining oxygenation during the procedure, those elements emerged from our joint work during my early career. And you have documentation, she pressed. Records that would substantiate these claims. Some, I acknowledged. Early drafts of papers with both our names. Research notes from cases we worked jointly. Correspondence with colleagues that references our collaborative approach. I hesitated, then added the most difficult truth. But much of it would have been in your father's private archives, which I lost access to after the divorce. Sophia absorbed this with visible effort. So, I would need to search his professional papers to fully understand the extent of this situation. If you're asking whether I need you to do that, the answer is no, I said carefully. The public acknowledgement your father made today is sufficient vindication for me personally, though the historical record will undoubtedly require correction over time. That's not why I'm asking, Sophia said, an edge entering her voice. I'm asking because I need to know the truth about the work I've built my career upon. I need to know whose shoulders I'm actually standing on. She looked down at her untouched coffee, then back at me with sudden directness. For years, I've proudly told colleagues I was expanding on Richard Westbrook's groundbreaking work. If that work was actually Eleanor Camden's, or even a true collaboration, then I've been perpetuating a falsehood, however unwittingly. The realization struck me with unexpected force. Sophia wasn't defending her father's reputation. She was questioning what these revelations meant for her own professional ethics. Despite being raised in Richard's image, she had apparently developed a commitment to truth and proper attribution that transcended loyalty to his narrative. The work was real, I said softly. The innovations were significant. Patients' lives were saved. The only falsehood was in who received credit, not in the value of the work itself. But that matters, Sophia insisted, surprising me with her vehemence. Proper attribution matters. Historical accuracy matters. I can't build my career on techniques attributed to the wrong person, even if that person was my father. In that moment, I saw something in my daughter that gave me profound hope, not just for our relationship, but for her future. Despite Richard's influence, despite years of estrangement from me, she had developed an ethical core that recognized the importance of truth over loyalty, of integrity over comfortable narratives. You remind me of myself at your age, I said before. I could reconsider the observation. Unwilling to accept convenient falsehoods, even when the truth is more difficult. Sophia looked startled, then thoughtful. I always thought I was like him, she said quietly. You have his focus, his precision, I acknowledged. But that commitment to truth, even when it's uncomfortable, that's something else entirely. A complex emotion flickered across her face, something between grief and revelation. I need to review his papers, she said after a moment. All of them, I need to understand exactly what happened, which contributions were collaborative, which were appropriated, not for legal reasons, but for integrity. I'll help however I can, I offered, careful not to push too hard in this fragile moment of reconnection. She nodded once, decisively. I should have access to his office at the hospital and the foundation headquarters. Between those locations, we should find most of his professional archives. She looked at me directly. Would you be willing to go through them with me? To identify what was originally yours? The invitation represented more than just historical investigation. It was an opening, tentative but real, to rebuild a relationship fractured by years of misunderstanding and deliberate division. Of course, I said simply. Whenever you're ready. Olivia, who had been silently observing our exchange with evident relief, finally spoke up. What about the foundation and the company? What will you do with them, Mom? It was the question I had been contemplating since Jonathan Mercer's Revelations at the Cathedral. What did one do with professional recognition and resources that arrived decades too late to restore the career that might have been? How does one reclaim authority in fields that had long since evolved without one's contributions? I'm not entirely sure yet, I admitted. The foundation does important work. Research that genuinely improves outcomes for children with congenital cardiac anomalies. That mission shouldn't be disrupted by changes in leadership. I paused, considering possibilities that had been forming in my mind. But perhaps its focus could be expanded to include supporting women in cardiothoracic surgery, particularly those facing career interruptions due to family obligations or workplace barriers. You could establish fellowships, Sophia suggested, her clinical mind immediately grasping practical applications. Create protected research time specifically for surgeon mothers. Fund childcare programs at major teaching hospitals. Address the structural barriers that force women to choose between professional advancement and family responsibilities. I agreed, feeling a spark of excitement at the possibilities. Exactly the barriers your father leveraged to limit my options. Transforming his legacy into the antidote for what he represented, Olivia observed with quiet insight. That's poetically perfect, actually. A small, determined smile, the first I'd seen from her since the funeral, flickered across Sophia's face. I'd like to be involved in that transformation, she said. Professionally, I mean. I have connections across major research institutions. I understand the current landscape of cardiac surgery in ways that could help implement these changes effectively. The offer took me by surprise. Not just the practical assistance, but the implicit acknowledgement that Sophia wanted to be part of reshaping her father's legacy, rather than simply defending it. It suggested a capacity for growth, for integration of difficult truths, that gave me profound hope for our future relationship. I'd welcome your involvement, I said carefully. Though I understand you have your own career, your own professional obligations. My fellowship at Mass General concludes in 3 months, Sophia replied. I was considering offers for the next stage of my career, but... She hesitated. In light of today's revelations, I think I need to reevaluate my path forward. Working, with the foundation, with you, to correct historical inaccuracies while creating better opportunities for women in surgery could be a meaningful direction. I felt tears threatening and blinked them back. After years of estrangement, after being positioned as the mother who had abandoned her family's needs for selfish pursuits, to hear my brilliant daughter suggest professional collaboration was overwhelming. I'd like that very much, I managed. Olivia reached across the table to squeeze my hand. And I meant what I said earlier, about helping organize the research papers, tracking the progression of ideas. My background in compositional analysis gives me skills for tracing how concepts evolve over time, even in fields outside music. Looking at my daughters, one a gifted surgeon, one a talented composer, both offering their distinct skills, to help reclaim what had been taken from me. I felt a wave of emotion too complex to name. It wasn't simple happiness or vindication, but something richer and more nuanced. The recognition that even after decades of erasure, truth had emerged, and with it the possibility of not just restoration, but new creation. "Thank you," I said simply. "Both of you." As afternoon light slanted lower through the cafe windows, our conversation shifted from the immediate shock of Richard's revelations to more practical considerations: legal next steps, access to his professional archives, the transition plan for Foundation leadership. The path ahead would undoubtedly include challenges: Vanessa's legal contests, potential resistance from the medical establishment to historical revisions, the complex emotional terrain of grief intertwined with revelation. But sitting across from my daughters, engaged in substantive discussion about reclaiming historical truth while shaping a more equitable future, I recognized that Richard's posthumous confession had created an opening for healing that might never have occurred otherwise. The journey of rebuilding, my professional identity, my relationship with my daughters, my understanding of my own past, was just beginning. But for the first time in decades, that rebuilding would be based on truth rather than carefully constructed illusions. And truth, however belated, creates possibilities that no perfectly crafted lie can sustain. 3 months after Richard's funeral, I stood at the podium of the Westbrook Medical Research Foundation's main lecture hall, facing an audience filled with the country's leading cardiothoracic surgeons, researchers, and medical journalists. The room hummed with anticipation, not just for the Foundation's new research initiatives I was about to announce, but for the woman delivering them, the previously invisible co-creator of methodologies that had saved thousands of young lives. "Good morning," I began, my voice steady despite the significance of the moment. "For those who don't know me, I'm Dr. Eleanor Camden, the new executive director of the Westbrook, or perhaps I should say, the Westbrook Camden Medical Research Foundation." A ripple of whispers moved through the audience at the name change, the first public indication of how thoroughly I intended to correct the historical record. In the front row, Sophia sat beside the chief of surgery from Massachusetts General, her expression a mixture of pride and resolve. Beside her, Olivia smiled encouragement, her laptop open to the presentation we had meticulously prepared together over weeks of archival research. Today marks not just a new chapter for this foundation, but an opportunity to acknowledge its true origins, I continued. Many of you have read the statements released following Richard Westbrook's death, detailing how research we conducted jointly during my early surgical career formed the basis for innovations that have become standard practice in pediatric cardiac surgery. Some of you may have questions about these claims. Others may wonder why revisiting authorship matters when the techniques themselves have proven so effective. I paused, looking directly at the audience rather than at my prepared notes. It matters because truth matters. It matters because proper attribution is fundamental to scientific integrity. It matters because the systematic erasure of contributions, particularly those of women in male-dominated fields, distorts not just individual careers, but our collective understanding of how medical knowledge advances. The room had gone completely still, the audience rapt with attention. In the 3 months since Richard's revelations, the medical community had been grappling with the implications, not just for the specific innovations attributed to him, but for the broader culture that had enabled such appropriation to go unchallenged for decades. Today, I'm not here to dwell on past injustices, but to introduce initiatives designed to ensure they aren't repeated, I continued. The Westbrook Camden Foundation is launching 3 major programs, each addressing a different aspect of the barriers that too often force brilliant minds, particularly women, to choose between professional advancement and family responsibilities. I outlined the initiatives we had developed. A fellowship program providing protected research time specifically for surgeon parents, funding for on-site childcare programs at major teaching hospitals, and a historical review commission tasked with examining attribution in major cardiovascular innovations of the past 30 years, with the goal of correcting the record where necessary. These programs represent more than just institutional change, I explained. They're an acknowledgement that genius doesn't conform to conventional career trajectories, that breakthrough insights often emerge from minds navigating complex personal and professional demands. That medical innovation benefits when we expand our definition of what a surgeon-scientist career can look like. As I spoke, I could see skepticism on some faces gradually giving way to consideration. These weren't radical concepts, but their implementation represented a significant departure from the rigid career structures that had defined cardiac surgery for generations, the very structures that had forced me to choose between professional advancement and family obligations. Leading the Historical Review Commission will be Dr. Sophia Westbrook, I announced, gesturing toward my daughter. Her dual perspective as both a rising cardiothoracic surgeon and someone personally affected by attribution issues brings unique insight to this complex task. Sophia stood briefly, acknowledging the announcement with characteristic poise. What the audience couldn't see was how thoroughly she had immersed herself in the project over the past months, reviewing her father's archives with forensic precision, tracing ideas through drafts, correspondence, and research notes to identify their true origins. Her commitment to accuracy had been unwavering, even when discoveries proved personally painful. Additionally, I continued, we're establishing the Eleanor Camden Fund for Women in Surgery, providing financial support and mentorship for female medical students specifically interested in cardiothoracic specialties, fields where women remain significantly underrepresented. This announcement drew spontaneous applause from several audience members, particularly the younger female surgeons scattered throughout the room. The fund represented more than financial support. It was a declaration that women belonged in operating rooms and research laboratories historically dominated by men. I stand before you today, not as someone seeking personal vindication, but as living proof that it's never too late to reclaim your voice, your contributions, your rightful place in history, I said, nearing the conclusion of my presentation. More importantly, I stand here committed to ensuring that no other surgeon faces the false choice between family and innovation, between personal fulfillment and professional recognition. As the applause rose around me, I felt a complex mixture of emotions, pride in what we were building, lingering grief for the career I might have had, and profound gratitude for the unexpected second chance to shape my field. The standing ovation wasn't just for me, but for every woman who had faced similar erasure, whose contributions remained unacknowledged, whose potential had been conscribed by structures designed without them in mind. After the presentation, a reception filled the Foundation's atrium, a soaring glass space where Richard had once hosted donors and celebrated his latest accolades. Now it buzzed with energy as surgeons, researchers, and journalists engaged with the detailed exhibits Olivia had created, documenting the collaborative origins of techniques long attributed solely to Richard. Dr. Camden? A young woman in surgical scrubs approached, hand extended. I'm Dr. Lily Chen, second-year cardiothoracic fellow at Cleveland Clinic. I just wanted to say... She hesitated, then continued with visible emotion. Your story has changed how I think about my own career. I've been struggling with whether to postpone having children until after fellowship, worried about being sidelined if I step back even temporarily. A concern I understand intimately, I replied, genuinely touched by her openness. The programs you announced today, especially the protected research time for surgeon parents, it makes me believe I might not have to choose, that I could be both the surgeon and the mother I want to be. She smiled, a mixture of hope and determination on her face. Thank you for fighting this battle so my generation might not have to. As Dr. Chen moved on, I felt a hand on my elbow. Sophia, elegant in a tailored navy suit, her expression suggesting she needed to speak privately. I excused myself from the conversation circle and followed her to a quieter corner of the atrium. "Vanessa's lawyers called," she said without preamble. "They want to schedule a settlement meeting." I raised an eyebrow, surprised after months of aggressive legal maneuvers. Settlement? Not continued litigation? Apparently, today's announcement changed their strategy, Sophia explained, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. The name changed to Westbrook Camden Foundation, the public rollout of the Historical Review Commission. It's made it clear you're not just taking control, you're systematically correcting the record in ways they can't easily fight. And they've realized continuing to contest the will means further public examination of exactly what Richard took, I concluded. Sophia nodded. The legal team thinks they're looking for a quiet financial arrangement, something that allows Vanessa to maintain her lifestyle without further public scrutiny of how Richard's professional reputation was built. I considered this development thoughtfully. The legal battles had been exhausting, with Vanessa's team filing motion after motion to delay the transfer of foundation control while they built their case for contesting the will. That they were now seeking settlement suggested the strategy was failing. Courts had consistently upheld Richard's final directives, recognizing both his legal right to distribute his assets and the compelling evidence supporting his claims about our collaborative work. "What do you think we should do?" I asked Sophia. Her legal insights had proven invaluable during these proceedings, her analytical mind quickly grasping nuances that might have taken me months to fully understand. "Settle," she said without hesitation. Not because she deserves compensation, but because continuing this battle diverts resources and attention from the work that actually matters. Transforming the foundation, implementing the new initiatives, correcting the historical record. Her pragmatism reminded me so much of my younger self, the surgeon who could separate emotional considerations from practical necessities when patients' lives were at stake. But there was something else in her approach, too. A clarity about priorities that suggested profound growth. "You're right," I agreed. The goal was never punishment, just correction and creation of something better. Sophia's expression softened slightly. "Besides, the lake house renovations are nearly complete. I know you're eager to move forward with the summer program for young women interested in medical careers." The lake house, Richard's family, property where he had proposed decades earlier, had indeed been undergoing transformation. Rather than selling it or using it as a personal retreat, I had decided to convert it into a residential program site where high school girls from underrepresented backgrounds could experience mentorship from leading women in medicine. The first cohort was scheduled to arrive in just 2 months. "The contractor says we'll be ready on schedule," I confirmed. Olivia's been coordinating with the interior designer to ensure the spaces feel inspiring rather than intimidating. "We want these young women to see themselves belonging in medicine from the moment they arrive." As if summoned by her name, Olivia appeared beside us, cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mom, there's someone you need to meet, Dr. Margaret Chen." "From Hopkins. She was apparently one of your residents during your brief teaching stint there. She specifically came today to reconnect with you." Before I could respond, Olivia was guiding me across the atrium toward a distinguished-looking woman in her late 40s, whose face broke into a wide smile as I approached. "Dr. Camden?" she said warmly, clasping my hand in both of hers. "You won't remember me. I was just a junior resident during your semester as visiting faculty at Hopkins, but your approach to the Norwood procedure quite literally changed the direction of my career." I searched my memory, finding fragments of that brief teaching position, one I had taken during the early years of my marriage when Richard's schedule had allowed me temporary professional engagement. "Dr. Chen, of course. You asked insightful questions about maintaining coronary perfusion during complex repairs." Her eyes widened in surprise. "You remember that? It was nearly 25 years ago, and you taught dozens of residents." "Good. Questions tend to stay with me," I replied honestly. as does the enthusiasm of young surgeons genuinely committed to improving outcomes for their tiny patients. Dr. Chen shook her head in wonder. Well, those techniques you demonstrated, the modifications to standard approaches that emphasized preservation of future growth potential, they became the foundation of my own research. I've published extensively on long-term outcomes using adaptations of your methods. She hesitated, then added with quiet intensity. When I read about what happened, about your contributions being unacknowledged, I needed to come today to tell you that at least some of us remembered. Some of us knew whose techniques we were really building upon. The revelation struck me with unexpected force. The idea that despite Richard's systematic erasure of my contributions, fragments of my approach had lived on through students I had briefly taught, surgeons who had observed my techniques during my limited time in operating rooms. My voice hadn't been completely silenced after all. It had merely been transmitted through different channels than I had expected. As the reception continued around us, I found myself approached by other surgeons with similar stories. Those who remembered observing procedures I had performed during my abbreviated career, who had incorporated elements of my techniques into their own practice, who had wondered why I had disappeared from the surgical landscape. Each conversation revealed threads of influence I had never known existed, impacts I had made even during my constrained professional engagement. Later that evening, as the foundation building quieted after the last guests departed, I found myself alone in what had previously been Richard's office, a grand space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the medical campus. In the 3 months since taking leadership, I had gradually transformed it, replacing the masculine leather and dark wood with warmer tones, collaborative seating arrangements, and walls now displaying not just Richard's achievements, but the broader historical context of pediatric cardiac surgery, including contributions from previously marginalized figures. Sophia found me there, silhouetted against the evening skyline. "Successful day," she observed, loosening the conservative silk scarf she had worn for the presentation. "Beyond anything I could have imagined," I agreed. "The response to the initiatives has been overwhelmingly positive. Several hospital systems have already expressed interest in implementing the child care program model." "That's not what I meant," Sophia said, settling into one of the visitor chairs. "I meant the way people responded to you, not just to the programs, but to you personally. They see you now. They recognize what was taken, what you've reclaimed." She hesitated, then added more quietly, "I'm sorry it took me so long to see it too." I turned from the window to fully face my daughter, struck by how far we had come in 3 short months. From the tense, formal interaction at the cafe following Richard's funeral to this moment of genuine understanding, the journey had not been easy, but it had been profoundly transformative for us both. "You were raised in a narrative carefully constructed to obscure certain truths," I said gently. "Breaking free of that narrative took remarkable courage." "It shouldn't have taken Father's confession for me to question it," she countered, the lingering pain evident in her voice. "I should have asked myself why a supposedly unstable, selfish woman managed to rebuild her life with such quiet dignity after leaving. Why someone who had abandoned her family continued reaching out to her daughters despite constant rejection. Narratives that support our worldview are extraordinarily difficult to question," I reminded her, "especially when they're reinforced by someone as persuasive as your father." I smiled softly. "The important thing is that when confronted with uncomfortable truths, you chose to examine them rather than deny them. That reflects character strength, not weakness." Sophia nodded slowly, absorbing this perspective. "The historical review commission is uncovering more cases," she said after a moment, shifting to the professional realm where she remained most comfortable with vulnerability. "Not just Father's appropriation of your work, but similar patterns throughout the department. Several female researchers whose contributions were minimized or attributed to male colleagues over the past 20 years. Not surprising, unfortunately," I acknowledged. We're going to correct all of it, Sophia stated with quiet determination. Every paper, every innovation, every clinical technique, proper attribution will be established regardless of whose reputation is affected. Her commitment to thoroughness, to truth regardless of consequences, moved me deeply. Despite being raised in Richard's image, she had developed an ethical core that transcended loyalty to narrative, even narratives that had shaped her understanding of her own family. Your father would be proud of the surgeon you've become, I said carefully, knowing this remained complex emotional territory. But I think he would be even more proud of the person you are, someone unwilling to accept convenient falsehoods when truth demands acknowledgement. Sophia's expression softened slightly. I'm still processing everything, about him, about us, about the family dynamics that shaped my understanding for so long. But I know one thing with certainty. I'm proud to be working alongside you now, to be part of correcting what was wrong while building something better. A knock at the office door interrupted our conversation. Olivia, still energized from the day's events despite the late hour. There you both are, she said, entering with a small gift bag in hand. I've been looking everywhere. Just debriefing after the presentations, I explained. Well, I have something for you, Olivia announced, suddenly looking both excited and nervous. She handed me the gift bag. It seemed like the right moment. Inside, I found a small velvet box. Opening it revealed a delicate silver pin in the shape of a heart, not an anatomically correct surgical heart, but the symbolic kind, embedded with 3 small birthstones, mine, Sophia's, and Olivia's. It's for your white coat, Olivia explained. For when you give the keynote at the American College of Surgeons conference next month. Something to remind you that whatever else was taken, whatever else was changed, the 3 of us remain connected. Not just by blood or history, but by choice, by the decision to rebuild what was broken. The thoughtfulness of the gesture, acknowledging both my return to professional visibility and the healing of our family bonds, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. It's perfect, I managed, touching the stones gently. Absolutely perfect. The foundation initiatives matter enormously, Olivia continued, her composer's eloquence emerging. The historical corrections, the programs for women in surgery, they'll create systemic change. But this, she gestured to the 3 of us standing together in the transformed office. This personal healing matters too. The reconnection of a family fractured by narratives designed to divide us. Sophia, typically uncomfortable with emotional moments, surprised me by nodding agreement. The personal and professional restoration happening simultaneously. It's somehow fitting, given how their deterioration was interconnected. Looking at my daughters, one who had followed her father's surgical path, but was now devoted to correcting historical injustices, one whose artistic sensibility brought beauty and meaning to technical endeavors, I felt a profound sense of completion that had nothing to do with professional vindication and everything to do with authentic connection. What happens next? Olivia asked, perching on the edge of the desk. After the settlement with Vanessa, after the historical commission completes its work, after the new programs are established, what do you want for yourself, Mom? The question gave me pause. For months I had been focused on reclaiming what had been taken, establishing the truth about past contributions, creating structures to prevent similar erasures in the future. But personal ambition, specific goals for my own fulfillment beyond restoration of what had been lost, that remained less defined. I think, I said carefully, I want to find the joy again. Not just in correcting past wrongs or creating better systems, but in the work itself. In teaching young surgeons, in seeing complex problems with fresh eyes, in remembering why I fell in love with medicine in the first place. You should perform surgery again, Sophia suggested with characteristic directness. Consultant status, teaching cases at the university hospital. Your hands would need time to retrain for complex procedures. but your knowledge remains invaluable. The possibility hadn't occurred to me that at 57, after years away from operating rooms, I might still have something to offer beyond administrative leadership or historical correction. But Sophia's matter-of-fact assessment, coming from a surgeon at the height of her technical abilities, suggested pathways I hadn't allowed myself to consider. The techniques have evolved, I pointed out. But not so fundamentally that you couldn't quickly adapt, Sophia countered. Modern imaging makes planning more precise. Instrumentation has improved, but the fundamental understanding of pediatric cardiac physiology, that's where your contributions were always most significant. Olivia watched this exchange with evident delight. I love that Sophia's trying to get you back into surgery. Full circle moment. I laughed softly, genuinely moved by my daughter's confidence in abilities I had been told for decades were irretrievably lost. I'll consider it, I promised, once the foundation initiatives are fully launched. As night settled over the medical campus, the three of us left the foundation building together, walking toward the parking lot under a clear spring sky brilliant with stars. The path ahead contained challenges: Vanessa's settlement negotiations, the continuing work of historical correction, the launch of new programs designed to ensure no other surgeon faced the impossible choices I had confronted. But walking between my daughters, I felt a profound sense of rightness that transcended the professional vindication Richard's confession had made possible. The truth, once spoken aloud, had created space not just for restoration of what was lost, but for entirely new possibilities. Reconnection with my daughters, professional contributions I had believed permanently foreclosed, joy I had forgotten was possible. As we reached our cars, Sophia surprised me with an uncharacteristic request. "Sunday dinner," she said, the words somewhere between question and statement. "At your place, just the three of us. I'd like to make it a regular thing." The simplicity of the invitation, a normal family gathering, the kind that had been impossible during years of estrangement, moved me more deeply than any professional recognition could have. "I'd like that very much," I said. Driving home to the modest but comfortable house I had purchased with part of the settlement funds, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 5 years earlier, I had walked away from a marriage that required my erasure, choosing authentic selfhood over comfortable submission. I had rebuilt a life from foundation level, finding meaningful work and genuine connections despite Richard's efforts to isolate me professionally and personally. Richard's posthumous confession hadn't given me back the years that were taken, or the career that might have been. But it had created space for a different kind of restoration. Not just of historical record or professional opportunity, but of family bonds fractured by carefully constructed lies. It had allowed my daughters to see me clearly for perhaps the first time in their adult lives, to recognize the mother who had not abandoned them, but had instead modeled the courage to choose truth over comfortable falsehood. And in that recognition lay the most profound healing of all, not the reclamation of professional contributions or material resources, but the restoration of authentic connection with the daughters I had never stopped loving, even when loving them had meant letting them find their own path back to truth. As I pulled into my driveway, I touched the small velvet box containing Olivia's gift, the heart pin with our 3 birthstones, a tangible symbol of broken bonds now carefully, deliberately mended. The professional recognition mattered. The historical corrections mattered. But this, the authentic reconnection with my daughters, their clear-eyed recognition of both past injustices and future possibilities, this was the true measure of restoration. The next chapter would not be defined by what had been taken, but by what we were building together, not just programs and initiatives, but relationships based on truth rather than carefully constructed illusions. And in that truth lay possibilities. Richard's narrative had never allowed us to imagine, not just professional collaboration, but genuine understanding across generations, perspectives, and experiences. Some journeys begin not with forward movement, but with return. Return to authenticity, to truth, to the essential self that remains even after years of systematic erasure. My journey had begun with the courage to leave when staying meant complete surrender of self. It had continued through years of quiet rebuilding, finding purpose and meaning despite isolation and misrepresentation. And now, with truth finally spoken aloud, that journey had expanded to include not just restoration of what was taken, but creation of something entirely new, professional structures that might prevent similar erasures, family bonds rebuilt on foundations of authentic understanding, and most importantly, the freedom to define myself, not in relation to past injustices, but in service to future possibilities. The heart pin would indeed adorn my white coat at next month's conference, a reminder that healing comes in many forms, that restoration extends beyond professional recognition to the connections that give life its deepest meaning, and that it is never too late to reclaim not just what was taken, but what remains possible when truth finally prevails over even the most carefully constructed lies. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe to our channel for more inspirational content. Share in the comments how you've overcome challenges in your own life. We'd love to hear your stories of resilience and reclamation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us,